بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين ثم أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي آمين يا رب العالمين. Dearest brothers, sisters, we're going to make a start now. I have one request, if you wouldn't mind. If you could come a little bit closer and huddle together so that we can be closer to one another, I would really appreciate that. Jazakumullahu khairan. MashaAllah. Okay, so today's dars, inshallah, will be on the topic of Andalusia, Muslim Spain. And before we even begin, I just want to make one introductory remark, and that is on the importance of studying history. Yeah, Allah the Almighty, He encourages us to study elements of history. Explicitly, Allah will say, قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانظُرْ كيف كان عاقبة الذين من قبل. Travel the world and see what happened to those who came before you, meaning the relics of perished nations. See what happened to them in order to take a lesson. Also Allah says, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. I swear by time that humanity is in deep loss. And one of the interpretations, tafsir of the word wal asr, is that I swear by human history. As if to say that if you go through history, one of the things that you will see repeatedly is innal insana lafi khusr. Human beings, they end up losing. Every time Allah sends a prophet, most of them reject him, and as a result they are destroyed. So we are told in the Quran many times that history is important, especially those parts of history that serve as a brilliant reminder to us, as if Allah the Almighty Himself wants us to learn how to live in this world by taking example from those who came before us, so we don't make the same mistake. And that is why it is shameful that many Muslims, they do not know their own history. I think most Muslims, even those who have studied a little bit about Islam, their history or knowledge of history only extends to the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is about 23 years. And then after that, everything becomes a bit hazy. Like if I were to say to you, who are the next four khulafa? Maybe you say their names, but I said to you, okay, what is the order in which they were given their reign? Maybe some people will get that right. But then after, I said, okay, who came to power and who were the Muslims being ruled over by the first dynasty? Does anyone know? You should know. You did last week, no? Who are they? The next dynasty was the Umayyads. And thereafter, who is the next dynasty? The Abbasids. And then after, who is the next dynasty? Is the Ottomans, right? This knowledge should be common knowledge amongst us, but it is not. It is not. And the weird thing is this. Andalusia, it represents a very unique time in our history, and that is why perhaps it gets a bit more attention than other parts of our history, because this is the first time that Muslims lived in Europe. And not only did they live in Europe, but they thrived in Europe, to the point that we had our golden era, as they say, in this period of time, which is Andalusia. And as a result, Muslims for the first time are living amongst non-Muslims, coexisting with non-Muslims whilst ruling them, and there is peace, there's prosperity, there is, in fact, enlightenment. And maybe that is the reason why today many European countries are so determined to make sure that the freedoms of Muslims are curtailed. The Muslims are not allowed to flourish and to prosper, because they know from history what these Muslims can do if they are left to rule over themselves and over others. As if they have learned from history how to deal with the Muslims but the Muslims have forgotten their own history. Allahul Musta'an. Yes, and that is why I'm very happy that Green Lane Masjid, Jazahumullah Khair, decided to put together this series, inshallah, to educate us. Now, I must say off the bat, I'm not an expert in this whatsoever. In fact, when they asked me to do the topic of Andalusia, I thought to myself, this is Allah's way of pushing me to learn about something important. And so I decided that, no, inshallah, we'll do some research. But what I'll share with you is just the basic skeleton with a few details here and there, hopefully enough for you to become interested, and then afterwards you can go about studying it in more detail. We want to learn from this period of time. We want to learn not just from the success stories, the conquests, the inventions, the culture, the art, the architecture, and all those positive things, but we also want to learn from the lows, from the failures, from the disunity, from the treachery, from the defeats. Because in everything, for the believer, there is lessons. Yeah. So at the end, inshallah, we'll go through some of the takeaways that we can gain from this period of time, known as the period of Andalusia, which spans 800 years. So what I want to do first is just break everything down into a timeline and then go through the timeline with each milestone, inshallah. So there are 7 milestones that I have put together. The first starts 7/11, right? A date that we should all remember, because this is a date that Tariq bin Ziyad entered into Spain and defeated King Roderick, the first Muslim to enter what they call the Iberian Peninsula, southern Spain from Gibraltar. And that triggered a 800-year rule over that part of the world, which was called Andalusia. Now, just a pause here. Where does Andalusia, the word, come from? It comes from the word Vandals. And Vandals were a group of people that came before and they conquered that area. And because the people who they conquered didn't have the word V in their language, they used to say Andals. And the land of the Andals is called Andalusia. Yes, Andalusia. So that is where the word comes from. So the first milestone was, what date is it? 7/11. Yes, you know the famous supermarket chain in America, 7-Eleven? Don't know if you know about that. Yes. We also know the 7/11 date for other reasons as well, but let's not go there. So this is an important date. The second important date is 732, the Battle of Tours, and this happened in France. So we'll get to that. We'll see how Muslims ended up in France, 100 miles away from Paris nonetheless. Then the third is 752, the Abbasids come to power. So Umayyads have been in charge all this time, and then 752, Abbasids come to power. And in 756, there's a return of Umayyad rule. Whereas before they were ruling from where? Damascus. Now we find that there is an emirate established, which is semi-independent from the Abbasids, and it is ruled by an Umayyad. Yes, Abdurrahman the First. So this is like the second era of the Umayyads that starts from 756 in Andalusia. Then in 929, Andalusia is declared an independent Khilafah from the Abbasids. Yes. So now, before the Umayyad Emirate in Andalusia was basically dependent, or not, semi-independent from the Abbasids. But then something happens where they basically, Abdurrahman III comes along and says, you know what, we're too powerful and strong now, we're going to be completely independent, and they break all their treaties with the Abbasids and they declare themselves a Khilafah, which means that there were 2 Khilafahs at that time. In fact, by them declaring that they were independent from the Abbasids, the Fatimids in Egypt also said, you know, we'll do the same thing, and they declared themselves to be a Khilafah as well. So at that time in the Ummah, there were how many Khilafahs? 3 Khilafahs. Yes, Allahumma musta'an. That was the level of disunity in the Ummah at that time. And then in the 1020, there was the Crusades that took place. Yes. And at the same time, there was this reconquest of Andalusia by Christian nations called the Reconquista. Yes. And this is where the Christians basically tried to get back their land of Andalusia from the Muslims. And ultimately they were successful. And in 1492 is the end of Muslim rule in Andalusia, where Isabella and the king, what's the name of the king? Who knows? No. Ferdinand. They come together to lay a siege to Granada, and the final city in Andalusia belonging to the Muslims falls in 1492. So the first and the last date is very important. So what is the first date? 7/11, very good. And the last date is? No, not 9, 1492. Yes, this is the beginning and the end. So you can see this is a long period, almost 800 years. And a lot happened. So let's go through this one by one. So the first date was 7/11. This is when Tariq bin Ziyad, he conquers, or he defeats King Roderick. And we all know the story. He arrived at the shores from Morocco all the way to Gibraltar. And there he brought with him an army of 10,000. And he burnt the ships. And what did he say? That famous statement to his soldiers: behind you is the ocean, in front of you is the enemy. Meaning there's nowhere else to go. We're going to defeat these people. And though he was successful, and though it was a great achievement, the reality is that it wasn't just the fact that they were courageous and brave and they were superior in might. They were not superior in might, because on the other side there was King Roderick. And he had a huge army. But the problem was, because he had raised taxes so much amongst his people, he became despised amongst them. And there were some other people amongst the elite that wanted to overthrow him. And in order to overthrow him, who did they reach out to? They reached out to the governor in Africa, Muslim, Musa. They reached out to him and said, you know what, if you come over here and try to attack King Roderick, we will do our best to make you successful. So what actually happened is that Musa ibn Nusayr sent Tariq ibn Ziyad, knowing that there was now some agreement with them and some of those elite amongst the Christians there to defeat King Roderick. And because of their working together, that is one of the reasons why Muslims were successful. Now what happened is that a year later, reinforcements are sent. About 18,000 men are sent from Africa, Muslim soldiers, the Berbers. And together with Tariq bin Ziyad's soldiers, Musa and Tariq, they go on a campaign, conquering more and more cities in Spain, Andalusia, until they reach Madrid, which is now the midway point, right? Much success comes their way by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the next milestone happens, which is 732. Now who remembers what happened in 732? The Battle of Tours, which is where? In France. Well remembered, in France. So now the Muslims, by this time, in 20 years, they have conquered nearly every major city in Andalusia, and they have gone beyond into France. In fact, they go so far to a place called Tours, which is just 100 miles away from Paris. And there they meet defeat, right? And from there is a pushback against the Muslims. Very interestingly, there was a BBC article a few years ago. The headline was, France's earliest Muslim burials have been found, dating back to the 8th century. And they said that the people in these graves may have been from North African soldiers due to a brief occupation of the southern part of France by an Islamic army. Now, some historians, they say that had the Muslims been successful in the Battle of Tours, perhaps the whole of Western Europe would have gone through an Islamicization, meaning Islam would have spread through the entirety of Europe. Allahu Akbar. That is how close the Muslims came to conquering this continent. Amazing, right? How comes then they did not try again? Well, the reality is that they didn't receive much help from the Umayyads. The Umayyads didn't really care much about Western Europe. They cared more about Eastern Europe, where there was obviously Palestine and the Byzantine forces, right? And on top of that, the Umayyads, they were embroiled in internal conflict by another rising clan. What is the name of that rising clan that they fear will take over from them? The Abbasids. So because of the internal conflict, and because really Western Europe doesn't have any civilization there. In London, there is about 9,000 people living in the city of London at that time. There's no real civilization. They're not concerned about Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa moving up and conquering more and more. In fact, not only do they not give them any reinforcements or any resources, and as a result, the Muslims are pushed further down through Andalusia until they remain in southern Spain, but they actually recall Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa back to Damascus when the next Amir arrives, and they are sent to court under false allegations of misappropriation, and so they are removed from the front lines of the Muslim army inside of Andalusia. And so there is no further conquest going up. Okay? So because of that, we find that there was not much attention paid to Andalusia until 752. In 752, the Abbasids come to power, right? And when the Abbasids come to power, what do? They want to get rid of any signs of the Umayyads. So they go on a killing spree. They want to kill every royal family member from the Umayyads just in case they come back again. And there is a famous story, an infamous story, where the Abbasids, they invited many royal family members from the Umayyads to a giant feast, and when they all got together, what did? They locked the doors and they killed everyone, right? They killed everyone, except for one person, one prince, whose name is Abdurrahman I. He got away. And there's a very amazing story about him fleeing, right? And when he flees, it is said that one of his family members gave him a bag of gold and told him, you know what, the Umayyads, if they find you, they will kill you. The Abbasids, if they find you, they will kill you. You must flee. And so what happens is that the story goes that they actually do locate him, they kill all of his family, but Abdurrahman I, he gets away, he swims across the Euphrates and he goes and lives in Iraq, and there he spends 5 years until he decides to go back to where? Andalusia. And where he goes first is to Morocco. And because his mother is a Berber, he can speak their language, and because he is of royal descent of the Umayyads, he manages to garner support from the Muslims there to take back Andalusia from who? The Abbasids. And he is successful. Yes? So he rises to power, and when he does conquer Andalusia now from the Abbasids, he says that this is going to be an independent Umayyad state. Though he doesn't say this is a Khilafah, he says this is somewhat independent from that. And then this brings in the second Umayyad dynasty, which will continue for 350 years, the center of which is now Andalusia and not Damascus. And under his rule, Abdurrahman I, they built the greatest masjid in the world at that time, and is known as the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Who has been there? Anyone been there? Yes. Now, one of the things that strikes you when you go in there is as soon as you enter, you see the arches. Yes, and the arches are designed in such a way that they seem to go on as far as the eye can see. And the amazing thing is that when we go to Medina Munawwara now, and we enter the Masjid al-Nabawi, we see the same thing, right? When we enter, we see the arches, and they seem to go on as far as the eye can see. Do you know who designed it first like that? It was the Muslims in Spain. It was the Muslims in Spain who came up with this idea of architecture that was then taken by the Muslims in Hijaz, and when they expanded Masjid Nabawi, they built it with the same design. Yes, the same design. So you have the Great Mosque of Cordoba that is built there, and that masjid has been standing, think about this, for 1,300 years. Allahu Akbar. 1,300 years that masjid has been standing and can be visited, and people still marvel at it today as a piece of art. The next milestone is 929. And now what happens is that the descendant of Abdurrahman I is Abdurrahman III. And Abdurrahman III is not like his grandfather. he wants to, seeing how powerful Andalusia has become, wants to declare it to be completely independent of the Abbasids and says that this is now a Khilafah in and of itself, announcing himself as the Khalifa. And as such, he broke all alliances with the Abbasids and the Fatimids. And I told you in the beginning, what did the Fatimids do when they heard that the Andalusians have pronounced themselves as an independent Khilafah? They said that we too are an independent Khilafah, which broke the Ummah into how many Khilafahs? 3. Yes, no, we're getting back to that point now. There's 3 Khilafahs now. The Fatimids, Abbasids and the Umayyads in Andalusia. If you were at Cordoba at that time, you would see that there was much success both in Deen and in Dunya. They said Cordoba itself contained 3,000 mosques and 100,000 shops and homes. And this is now the beginning of what they call the Golden Age. Abdurrahman III, he does some incredible things in terms of dunya at least. He is the first person to mint coins in his own figure, yes, which can still be found in museums today. He built a massive palace complex known as Madinatul Zahra, named after his wife Zahra. And this was like a small, tiny town built for royalty. If you were part of the royal family, you could live there, or if you were very, very rich, you could also live there. And in that Madinatul Zahra, there was some things that no eye had ever seen, such as running water in every home. No one had come across this before, that you could, in your home, have running water. Also, they had these things called the peacock water clocks. This was invented by, anyone know? Abbas ibn Firnas. And this clock, basically, the way it worked, it had a tipping bucket. It would be filled with water and it would tip out, and there was a design of a peacock. And with this, you could tell the time. No one had thought of this before. No one had invented this before. And there was so much lavishness inside of this city. Yes. He built the largest library in the world at that time. It's said to have contained over 500,000 books. He wanted to build it bigger than the library at that time, which was where? In Baghdad. You can see the rivalry. In Baghdad, they had the biggest library. He wanted to outdo it, and so he built one here in Andalusia. Now, of course, where does the money come to build all of these things? Where does all this wealth come from? It comes from taxes. So Abdurrahman III was heavily taxing his people, building these palaces, these mini cities with all these extravagances, and the people resented him for that. They didn't like him for that. And in fact, that city only lasted 30 years, because within 30 years, it was destroyed, not by an outside invader, but by the local people themselves. They demolished it. In fact, what remains today are just the foundations of Madinatul Zahra. Yeah, so this now actually spells the downfall of Andalusia, Muslim Spain. And you can see how things have changed a lot. And there is a lot of what now? A lot of dunya has entered the hearts of the people that are ruling over them. I remember when I went to Alhambra Palace. Anyone been to Alhambra Palace here? Yes? I mean, it is astonishing. The architecture, the art, the way they have used water. I mean, when we went there, I was a teenager and we had a tour guide. And one of the things I remember about this tour guide, they were explaining, how things were built and the beauty and even, the calligraphy. What does it say? La ghaliba illallah. There is no conqueror except Allah. So I read that and I thought, well, these people were so pious. But then when you went further inside, I looked up and there was artwork, and then I saw there were drawings of people with faces. And I remember saying to my father that this is haram, why do they have pictures of people? Who made these? So we asked the tour guide and she said, these are some of those sultans, the governors. They made paintings and, put them up there on the ceilings in their own name, in their own faces. And then I thought, that doesn't sit right with me. What happened to these people? Something changed inside of them. Yes? And so Madinatul Zahra was destroyed by the Muslims themselves. And this is the beginning of the downfall. Because what happens next is now in the 1050, 1020, something begins in the world known as the Crusades. Now, what the Crusades represent is this new movement in the Christian world to recapture the Holy Land. What is the Holy Land to them? Jerusalem, Ahsant. They want to capture Palestine from the Muslims. And there is one pope, his name is Pope Innocent III, not very innocent. He made a fatwa, an edict, and he said basically that whoever from the Christian world wears a cross and just goes to travel in order to reclaim the blessed land, he will have his plot in paradise. He will have his place in paradise, guaranteed basically. And so there was a religious fervor that took hold of the Christian world to basically go to war with the Muslims. At the same time, even though Andalusia is not connected to Jerusalem in the same region, the Christian nations that were once inhabiting Andalusia, they also caught this bug and they thought, you know what, why don't we use this to try to reconquer the lost land of Andalusia? That is from their perspective. And so we find that there was this reconquista, where they tried to then fight the Muslims once again in Andalusia to take back, and they were successful. And the first city to fall in Muslim Spain was Toledo. Toledo was the first city to fall to the hands of the Christians. And interestingly, when they conquered this city, they did not pillage or destroy anything. Today, if you were to go to the city, you can still see homes and masjids from the time of Andalusia Muslim Spain rule. Why? Because when they came, they realized that this is all so advanced that we need to benefit from this. And so there were some very notable people from the Christian world that would send their children, listen to this, they would send their children to study in the universities in Toledo under Muslim scholars. What were they teaching in? What language? Arabic. So these Christians, not only were they living amongst Muslims, they were learning Arabic, studying in Muslim universities, studying fiqh, and studying other sciences like medicine, like chemistry, like physics. And a little interesting side note here. One of the popes, I can't remember which one, he actually came to Toledo to see what the Christians were doing there. And he was shocked to see that many of them were studying amongst the Muslims in their universities. And he picked out someone whose name is Robert, who was a student of medicine in one of those universities, a top student, and gave him a task. Robert of Ketton. Does anyone know what his task was? His task was to translate the Quran. Translate the Quran into what language? Yeah? Latin. Did someone say Latin over there? Yes, to translate it into Latin. It was the first ever translation of the Quran from Arabic into Latin. And the reason why this Pope wanted him to do that was not to educate Christians about Islam, but in order to translate it in a way that confirms all the bad things they say about the Muslims. Yes, that was his idea behind it. In any case, what we see is that when the Europeans would come to Muslim Spain, they would see advancements in education and in culture and in art and architecture that made them marvel at the Muslims. In fact, made them want to be like the Muslims, dress like the Muslims, be educated like the Muslims. It is almost as though it came in a different world to what we are today, where we see that is almost the opposite, that the Muslims, they look up to the West and they want to come here to learn like them, to dress like them, and to speak like them. Allah musta'an. But it was not always like this. In fact, it was the opposite. Yes, it was the opposite. We ask Allah the Almighty to bring about that time once again. Allahumma ameen. Now, every city begins to fall in Muslim Spain. Muslims of North Africa, they do attempt to fight back. For example, there was a siege of Lisbon in 1147, but they are largely unsuccessful. Within 200 years, every Muslim city in Andalusia falls, except for one. And you want to guess which one survives? No, Andalus is the whole area. Huh? Granada, yes, Granada. This is the only one. And the reason why it manages to survive is because it is connected to the sea. And as a result, it can be supplied resources and reinforcements from North Africa Muslim, but also because it was naturally fortified by mountains. Anyone who's been to Alhambra, for example, you will see it is very high up. Yes, and as a result, militarily, it is also protected as well. And so what happens is that even though Cordoba falls in 1236, it is not until 1492 that Granada falls. And for that time, for 250 years, it was under the Nasrid dynasty. Yes, under the Nasrid dynasty until 1492. Now what happens? Now if you think back, how did Tariq bin Ziyad manage to conquer Andalusia? Was it just his 10,000 men and burning the ships? What did I say? It wasn't just that. What did he do? What did he do? He worked with who? The local Christians that wanted to bring about the downfall of King Roderick. Now, Allah musta'an, the exact same thing happens the other way around. So, in the Nasrid dynasty, there are many who do not like their leaders, and there is infighting, and there is treachery, and there are emirs killing their sons, and all the rest of it. And what do? Some of them plan and conspire to work with the Christians. Yes? So they conspire with two Christian principalities. One is Isabella and one is Ferdinand. And they lay a siege on Granada. And eventually the ruler of Granada at that time, Abu Abdullah, he surrenders, and all royals had to flee. There was an agreement. And one of the things that Abu Abdullah placed in the agreement to surrender was that the Muslims will be allowed to stay and allowed to practice their religion freely. And all the qada, all the judges and the courts will remain here so they can live by Muslim law under your rule. Yes? Now, they accepted those terms, but how long do you think they stayed true to those terms? Isabella, 100 years? 50 years? Less than 10 years, basically. Within less than 10 years, what were they saying to the Muslims of Spain? You have three options. Become Christian, go to North Africa, or be killed. Yes, be killed. Now, there is a few more hundred years before, we have the final expulsion of the Muslims from Spain. But that, unfortunately, was the end of the Muslim rule in Spain in 1492. Now, during this time, I mentioned there was a lot of success both in Deen and Dunya, and I'll just mention some notable names. One of them is Abbas ibn Firnas. Ibn Firnas is famous for his contributions in the field of astronomy and engineering. He's the first to manufacture clear glass. Also, the first to make a gliding device in the field of aviation, which actually became his downfall because whilst he was testing his glider, he actually died as a result as well. Then is Ibn Haytham, father of optics, because he was the first to correctly explain the theory of vision, which is connected to the mind and light. In fact, his book, Kitab al-Manadir, was used by Isaac Newton and Galileo and cited by them many years afterwards. Ibn Sina, known as the father of early medicine. And his book, Ash-Shifa, yes, became the standard book to learn medicine from for 500 years, all the way until the 1700s. Can you imagine? Much of what we learn in medicine came from the works of this Muslim man operating in the time of Muslim Spain rule, Ibn Sina. And then there's Ibn Rushd in the field of philosophy. A lot of the works, the Greek works of the philosophers was translated and then refined by Ibn Rushd and produced even more works in that field and became an authority. And then there are some others that I wanted to mention. One of them, I believe, is connected to all of us, but we don't know. And his name is Abu Amr ad-Dani. Who has heard of Abu Amr ad-Dani before? Just put your hand up. You know because I've told you, that's why. Abu Amr ad-Dani, yes, al-Andalusi, he is the one who wrote the first manual to help students learn the qira'at. And that manual was then taken by Ash-Shatibi and turned into a poem which is used until today to learn the qira'at. Imagine. Everyone who learns the qira'at, they are indebted to Abu Amr ad-Dani, who is from where? Andalusia. Yes. And the field of qira'at is indebted to his work because he wrote that manual. Then you have famous scholars in the field of tafsir like Imam al-Qurtubi, yeah, from Cordoba. Also Ibn Atiyah al-Andalusi. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah said that he praised the book of Imam al-Tabri and then the book of who? Ibn Atiyah. He said these are the most authentic books in tafsir. Yeah, the book of Imam al-Tabri and the book of Ibn Atiyah, who is an Andalusian scholar. Now just finally some of the lessons, some of the takeaways. One of the lessons that I personally take from this is to do with the success that the Muslims had in both in deen and dunya. And the reason why I feel they had success in both is because they never separated between the two. We find that many Muslim scholars were not just ulama in the Islamic sciences, but also scholars in other fields. For example, Imam al-Shafi'i was also a medical doctor as well. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah was also a doctor in the physiological sense as well. And so what the mindset that they had is that Allah the Almighty created this world and everything inside of it. The more we study of this dunya, whether that's through science or astronomy or any other science, what we class as non-religious, will lead us to understand and appreciate the khalq of Allah. And as a result, we should not hold back in that. And so their study of the sciences was done in order to find and discover more of who Allah is. And sometimes, you know, when you watch a documentary about the sea life, for example, and you see amazing things, what does it make you say? What comes out of your mouth when you see those amazing things? MashaAllah or Subhanallah. And this is what Allah says, الَّذِينَ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. They are those people who they ponder and reflect over what Allah has created in the skies and the earth. رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقَتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا. They say, oh our Lord, you never created this without any purpose. But today we find that when people think becoming a student of knowledge, in their mind, what do they believe is the knowledge that should be studied? It is the Islamic sciences, and no doubt they are the most valuable. But then they compare that and contrast that with the other sciences, which they call secular sciences, which more accurately should be called non-religious sciences. And as a result, we find that there is some kind of friction between them, a distance between them. But for those Muslims, they were all part and parcel of the same piece of knowledge, though there was obviously some knowledge that is more valuable than others. Another lesson that we learn is that essentially it was the love of dunya that changed their hearts and led to the downfall of the Muslims. Yeah? And this happened at the time of the Prophet ﷺ to a small degree during the Battle of Uhud. The Prophet ﷺ, he told a group of archers that they must stay stationed where they are and they should not leave even if they see the vultures pecking at the corpses of the Muslims. You remember that? Yes? Why did they move? They thought that the Muslims were victorious. And as a result, they decided to come down from there, from those positions, even though their leader told them, the Prophet ﷺ ordered us to stay here, whether we are winning or whether we are losing. Now, why were they so insistent on moving? Because they thought we would not be able to get the spoils of war. Things have been left for the taking now. We should enjoy the spoils of war. And when they came down off the hill and disobeyed the command of the Prophet ﷺ, who was waiting in the wings? Khalid bin Walid radiallahu ta'ala. Not yet a Muslim, who came in, swooped in and attacked the Muslims from the rear, and then they were attacked by the Quraysh, who turned around, and then heavy losses. 70 people lost their lives, including the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, Hamza radiallahu ta'ala. Allah the Almighty, in Surah Al-Imran, He commented on that, and He said, Minkum man yuridu dunya wa minkum man yuridu al-akhirah. Some from amongst you, you love the dunya. Some from amongst you, you love the akhirah. Ibn Mas'ud, he said, I swear by Allah, I never knew that amongst us was anyone who loved the dunya until I heard Allah say it. Subhanallah. Why did Allah mention that? To make us understand that you were winning. Uhud was yours. They were running away. Why did they get the upper hand? Because of hubb ad-dunya. Yes, hubb ad-dunya.